The courtroom in San Francisco had grown unusually quiet. Bradley Pennington stood confidently beside his attorney, one hand resting on the polished wooden table as if the verdict had already been decided. His voice carried easily across the room. "My wife never built anything," he said, glancing briefly toward the gallery. "After this divorce, she'll be nothing." A few quiet chuckles moved through the room. Across from him, Zara Pennington didn't react. She simply sat there, hands folded over a small notebook, her expression calm, almost distant. What Bradley didn't notice was the courtroom door opening behind him. An older man had just walked in. And within the next hour, Bradley would discover something no one had told him. The company he was so proud of had never truly been his. Before we step into the full story, take a moment to say hello in the comments. Let us know where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. It's always powerful to see how many people around the world care about stories where truth eventually finds its way to the surface. And if you believe that dignity, patience, and quiet strength still matter in this world, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss stories like this one. Because what happened to Zara Pennington didn't unfold in a single moment. It unfolded slowly, carefully, and with records that never lied. Long before the courtroom in San Francisco, before Bradley Pennington spoke with the careless confidence of a man certain he had already won, there was a quieter version of the story. It began years earlier in Portland, Oregon. Zara Pennington, then still Zara Caldwell, had never been the kind of person who filled a room with noise. She didn't interrupt conversations. She didn't compete for attention. Most people who met her remembered only two things at first: her steady eyes and the small notebook she almost always carried. Inside that notebook were numbers, patterns, observations. Not dramatic thoughts, not diary entries, just information. Zara had grown up in a modest neighborhood where practicality was a form of survival. Her father had worked as an electrical engineer for most of his life. Her mother had taught middle school mathematics. At their dinner table, conversations rarely drifted toward emotion or speculation. They revolved around logic, how things worked, why systems failed, what made them function better. By the time Zara left for the University of Washington, she had already developed the habit that would define much of her life. She watched first, spoke later. She studied financial analytics, not because it was fashionable, not because it promised fame, but because numbers told the truth in ways people often refuse to. Spreadsheets didn't exaggerate. Balance sheets didn't flatter. Cash flow didn't lie. After graduation, Zara accepted a position at a mid-sized logistics consulting firm in Seattle. The work wasn't glamorous. Her job involved studying shipping routes, analyzing fuel costs, and building predictive models that companies could use to make better transportation decisions. It was precise work, quiet work, exactly the kind she preferred. Bradley Pennington entered her life on a rainy evening during a regional startup conference. The event had been held in a converted warehouse overlooking the Puget Sound. Young founders moved through the crowd in tailored jackets and confident smiles, pitching ideas to anyone willing to listen. Bradley stood out immediately. Not because his idea was the most revolutionary in the room, but because of the way he told the story. Tall, charismatic, with a voice that carried easily across a conversation, and Bradley had the kind of presence investors often mistook for vision. He spoke about transforming freight logistics for small retailers, about using technology to streamline regional delivery networks, about building a company that would make shipping faster, cheaper, and smarter. Most people heard ambition. Zara heard something else. Opportunity. Not the opportunity Bradley believed he was presenting, but the structural gaps in the model he described. Later that evening, they ended up standing beside the same table of coffee and pastries. Bradley was still talking when Zara asked her first question. "What's your projected fuel variance under seasonal route shifts?" Bradley blinked. For a moment, the confident rhythm of his speech faltered. No one at the conference had asked him something like that. He smiled instead. "Honestly," he said, "I don't have the exact model built yet." Zara nodded. I could build one, she replied. It was not flirtation. It was simply a statement. That was how their partnership began. Over the next several months, Bradley and Zara met frequently in coffee shops, co-working spaces, and eventually, Bradley's small rented office. Bradley focused on pitching the idea to investors and building relationships. Zara focused on the architecture beneath the story. She built the company's first financial model, then the second, then the operational cost projections. She mapped potential freight routes along the West Coast and calculated how small retailers could consolidate shipments to reduce costs. The company Bradley envisioned began to take shape inside Zara's spreadsheets long before it existed anywhere else. They named it Pennington Freight Solutions. At first, Bradley insisted the name was temporary. "We'll rebrand later," he said, but the name stayed. The company's early days were not glamorous. There were weeks when they worried about payroll, months when potential clients politely declined proposals, days when the entire operation seemed like an idea too fragile to survive the real world. During those periods, Bradley talked constantly about the future. Zara adjusted the numbers to make sure they could reach it. By the second year, the company began securing small regional contracts. Zara's route optimization models helped reduce delivery times for several independent retail chains across Washington and Oregon. Word spread quietly through logistics networks. Efficiency mattered. Predictability mattered. Pennington Freight Solutions started to grow. The first time Bradley appeared in a local business article, the reporter asked him how the company had managed to stabilize its early finances. Bradley answered with enthusiasm. "We built a system that keeps our operations lean and adaptive," he said. "That's been the key." Zara read the article later that evening at their kitchen table. Her name did not appear in it. She didn't mention this to Bradley. At the time, she didn't think it mattered. The following year, the company moved its headquarters to San Francisco. The logistics industry on the West Coast was expanding rapidly, and Bradley believed the move would position them closer to larger clients and venture capital networks. Zara agreed with the strategic reasoning. But she also noticed something else during that transition. As the company grew, Bradley began telling the story of its origins more often. At networking events, at conferences, on small podcasts. Each time the story changed slightly. In the earliest versions, he spoke about the company as something they had built together. Later, the phrasing shifted. "I started the company with an idea about modernizing freight logistics." Eventually, the sentence shortened even further. "I built Pennington Freight Solutions from the ground up." Zara noticed. She did not correct him. Instead, she continued working. Her days filled with financial projections, vendor negotiations, and operational data analysis. The company hired its first chief financial officer, Thomas Avery, who quickly learned that Zara already understood most of the financial infrastructure better than anyone else in the office. Thomas respected her. Bradley admired her efficiency. But admiration was not the same thing as recognition. Gradually, Bradley became the public face of the company. Investors liked him. Journalists liked him. Conference organizers invited him to speak. He was energetic, confident, and always ready with a polished explanation of how Pennington Freight Solutions was transforming regional shipping. Zara rarely attended those events. She preferred the quiet order of spreadsheets to the uncertain theater of public conversation. To many people in Bradley's expanding professional circle, Zara became a vague figure. They heard about her occasionally. Bradley would mention his wife in passing. "She prefers staying out of the spotlight," he sometimes said. That explanation satisfied most people. But inside the company's internal systems, inside the forecasting models, the financial safeguards, the route analytics that kept operations profitable, Zara's work remained everywhere, invisible to outsiders, indispensable to the company itself. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Bradley began to believe a version of the story that left her out entirely. Not because he consciously decided to erase her, but because success has a way of simplifying memories. The louder the applause became around him, the easier it was for Bradley Pennington to forget how quiet the beginning had actually been. Zara, however, did not forget. She kept the original spreadsheets, the early contracts, the emails that documented how decisions had truly been made. She kept everything the way she kept most things in her life, calmly, methodically, and without ever announcing that she was doing it. Years later, when Bradley would stand in a courtroom and declare that Zara Pennington had never built anything, he would be speaking with absolute confidence. But confidence and truth are not the same thing. And long before that courtroom day arrived, Zara had already begun preparing for the moment when the difference between them would finally matter. In the beginning, Pennington Freight Solutions existed almost entirely inside Zara's laptop. Bradley liked to tell people the company had been born from bold vision and relentless hustle. In some ways, that version wasn't entirely wrong. Bradley was relentless. He had the kind of energy that kept conversations alive long after others had grown tired. But vision alone could not calculate fuel volatility across 3 states. Vision did not negotiate insurance margins. Vision did not stabilize a fragile logistics network when a single missed shipment could unravel an entire contract. Those tasks belonged to Zara. During the company's first year in Seattle, their office had been a narrow room above a small print shop. The building smelled faintly of ink and paper, and the heating system rattled every winter morning before finally warming the space. Bradley spent most of his days outside that office meeting potential clients, attending startup gatherings, speaking with investors who listened politely but rarely committed to anything concrete. Zara remained inside. Her work was meticulous. She built the company's first operational spreadsheet with over 30 interconnected tabs: fuel costs, seasonal shipping patterns, highway congestion probabilities, warehouse handling times. Each variable influenced the next. If a shipment left Tacoma at 6 in the morning instead of 8, Zara's model could estimate the difference in delivery reliability by the time the truck reached Sacramento. Bradley didn't understand most of the formulas, but he understood the results. "Investors love numbers like this," he told her once, leaning over her desk while she worked late into the evening. Zara nodded without looking up. "Numbers like this just mean the plan works," she said quietly. The distinction mattered to her. To Bradley, they meant opportunity. Their first significant contract arrived almost by accident. A regional chain of outdoor equipment stores was struggling with inconsistent shipping from its suppliers. Delays were costing them money during peak sales seasons. Bradley heard about the problem through a networking contact and immediately scheduled a meeting. Before that meeting, Zara spent 2 nights building a tailored proposal. She analyzed the retailer's shipping history, mapped the existing routes, and constructed an optimized distribution plan that reduced delivery variance by nearly 20%. Bradley presented the proposal. The client signed a 6-month pilot agreement. It wasn't a large contract, but it was enough to keep the company alive. From that point forward, the pattern repeated itself. Bradley opened doors. Zara ensured there was something solid behind them. Over time, Pennington Freight Solutions developed a reputation among smaller West Coast retailers for reliability. The company wasn't the cheapest option, but its delivery predictions were unusually accurate. Zara's forecasting models made sure of that. By the end of the 2nd year, the company had grown from 2 employees to 12. It was around that time Bradley decided they needed a more formal financial structure. That decision led to the hiring of Thomas Avery. Thomas had spent most of his career working in corporate finance departments that valued caution over ambition. When Bradley first interviewed him, Thomas noticed 2 things immediately. Bradley was charismatic, and Zara's spreadsheets were far more sophisticated than anything typically built by early-stage startups. On Thomas's first day, Zara walked him through the company's financial systems. She spoke calmly, explaining how each data set influenced operational decisions. Thomas followed along carefully, occasionally asking questions that revealed both curiosity and professional respect. After 2 hours, he leaned back in his chair. "Most companies your size don't have modeling this detailed," he said. Zara shrugged slightly. "It helps prevent expensive surprises." Thomas smiled. "I like preventing those." From that point forward, he considered Zara the quiet foundation of the company. Bradley, meanwhile, was beginning to enjoy a different kind of momentum. As Pennington Freight Solutions grew, so did his public presence. Industry podcasts invited him to talk about the future of regional logistics. Startup conferences offered him speaking slots. Journalists occasionally requested interviews about the challenges of building a freight network from scratch. Bradley accepted every opportunity. He had a natural gift for storytelling. On stage, he described the company's journey with enthusiasm, how he had recognized inefficiencies in the shipping industry, how he had worked tirelessly to build a solution, how persistence had turned an idea into a growing business. Audiences appreciated the narrative. Entrepreneurship, after all, thrived on stories of individual determination. Zara rarely attended those events. During one conference in San Jose, and Bradley called her afterward, excited about how well his presentation had gone. "They loved the story," he said. "What part of the story?" Zara asked gently. Bradley laughed. "You know, the whole journey." Zara didn't press further. She understood something Bradley did not. Stories simplified reality. Spreadsheets did not. As the company expanded into California, Bradley decided to relocate headquarters to San Francisco. The move placed them closer to major logistics corridors and venture capital firms interested in transportation technology. The transition required significant planning. Zara managed most of it. She renegotiated vendor agreements, recalculated shipping routes, and ensured that the company's financial forecasts accounted for the higher operational costs associated with the Bay Area. When they finally moved into a modern office building overlooking the Embarcadero, Bradley celebrated the moment with a small company gathering. Standing in front of the team, he raised a glass. 3 years ago, this was just an idea, he said proudly. Today we're building something real. The employees applauded. Zara stood near the back of the room watching quietly. She wasn't uncomfortable with Bradley receiving attention. What interested her more was how easily narratives evolved. During the early months of the company, Bradley had frequently described them as partners. Their shared effort had been part of the story, but as new employees joined people who had not witnessed those early struggles, the language changed. Bradley now referred to the startup as something he had founded. Zara became part of the background, not deliberately erased, simply omitted. Thomas Avery noticed this shift more than once during executive meetings. Whenever Bradley described strategic decisions, he rarely mentioned that many of those decisions had originated inside Zara's financial models. Thomas found the situation curious. But Zara never corrected it. She continued doing what she had always done, observing, recording, and adjusting the numbers. Late one evening, months after the San Francisco movie, Zara remained in the office long after most employees had left. The city lights reflected across the dark windows as she reviewed several years of archived company files. Early emails, original financial projections, initial investor discussions. She organized everything into carefully labeled folders, not because she expected to use them, but because Zara had learned something important during her years working with financial systems. Information mattered most when people forgot it existed. And people often forgot, especially when success encouraged them to rewrite the past. Across town, Bradley attended a networking dinner with venture capitalists who were beginning to show interest in expanding the company's operations. He spoke confidently about growth opportunities and market disruption. He described himself as the architect of Pennington Freight Solutions. No one questioned the claim. After all, Bradley believed it. Confidence made stories convincing, but somewhere inside Zara's laptop and inside the quiet records, she continued to preserve another version of the company's history remained intact. A version built not from applause or interviews, but from numbers that could still be traced back to the very beginning. Years later, those records would become far more important than Bradley ever imagined. Because when stories collapsed under legal scrutiny, spreadsheets were often the only witnesses that never changed their testimony. Success rarely arrives with a sudden noise. More often, it grows quietly. One contract, one introduction, one opportunity layered carefully over another, until the weight of it begins to change the people involved. By the fourth year of Pennington Freight Solutions, the company had grown into something that looked stable from the outside. They occupied 2 floors of a glass office building near the San Francisco waterfront. Trucks bearing the company's logo moved regularly along West Coast highways. Industry publications occasionally mentioned Bradley Pennington as one of the emerging voices in regional logistics. The company was no longer fragile. It was becoming visible. And visibility had a way of altering behavior. Bradley had always enjoyed attention, but now attention followed him naturally. Invitations arrived: weekly conferences in Los Angeles, transportation panels in Chicago, technology summits in Austin. At first, he accepted these invitations cautiously. Later, he accepted them eagerly. One morning during a quarterly leadership meeting, Bradley announced that the company would be hiring a professional public relations consultant. Visibility matters, he told the team. If we want to compete nationally, we need a stronger narrative. The consultant he hired was Vanessa Blake. Vanessa arrived on a Tuesday afternoon wearing a charcoal suit and carrying a portfolio of case studies from previous clients in the technology sector. She spoke quickly, confidently, and seemed to understand exactly how media narratives were constructed. During her initial presentation to the leadership team, she outlined a strategy for positioning Bradley as a thought leader in logistics innovation. Investors respond to strong founder stories, she explained. People need a face to associate with the brand. Her plan included interviews, speaking engagements, and a series of carefully placed opinion articles in business publications. Throughout the meeting, Zara sat quietly near the end of the conference table. Vanessa noticed her eventually. "And you are?" she asked. "Zara Pennington," Zara replied. Vanessa smiled politely. "Operations, financial systems." Vanessa nodded as if that detail fit neatly into her understanding of the company. For her purposes, it did. Over the following months, Vanessa's strategy began producing results. Bradley appeared in several industry podcasts discussing the future of freight automation. An article about emerging logistics startups featured his photograph beside the headline, "The Founder Reinventing Regional Shipping." Each appearance reinforced the same narrative. Bradley Pennington, the visionary entrepreneur who had built Pennington Freight Solutions from a bold idea. Inside the company, operations continued to run according to the model Zara maintained. She updated fuel projections, revised delivery route algorithms, adjusted financial forecasts when new contracts expanded the company's obligations. The systems she had built years earlier had grown more complex, but their purpose remained unchanged. Predict, stabilize, prevent collapse. One evening, Thomas Avery stopped by Zara's desk after most employees had left. He had been reviewing the latest quarterly projections. "These numbers are remarkably steady," he said, tapping the printed report in his hand. "They should be," Zara replied. Thomas hesitated before speaking again. "You ever think about stepping into a more visible role?" Zara looked up from her screen. Visible how Thomas gestured vaguely. "Presentations, investor meetings, the media stuff Bradley's been doing." Zara considered the idea for a moment. Then she shook her head. "I prefer systems that work even when no one is watching." Thomas smiled faintly. That's probably why they work. Across the office, Bradley and Vanessa often stayed late discussing upcoming media appearances. Vanessa understood how narratives influenced perception, and she refined Bradley's public story carefully. During one rehearsal for a conference speech, she interrupted him midway. "You're including too many operational details," she said. "Audiences don't need the spreadsheets. They need the vision." Bradley leaned back in his chair. "Right, vision." Vanessa nodded. "You saw inefficiencies in freight logistics. You built a company to solve them. That's the core message." Bradley repeated the revised version of the story several times until the rhythm felt natural. Gradually, the early partnership he once described began disappearing from the narrative entirely. Not out of malice, simply because it made the story cleaner. Meanwhile, inside the company's internal email systems, Zara noticed subtle changes. Decisions that once involved quiet discussions between her and Bradley were now routed through layers of management. Vanessa occasionally joined executive meetings even when the agenda concerned operational issues. Bradley's schedule became increasingly full. Interviews, travel, public appearances. The company continued to grow, but Bradley spent less time reviewing the underlying financial systems that supported that growth. Zara did not object. Instead, she adapted. Her habit of documentation, which had begun during the company's earliest months, slowly expanded. She archived internal emails, stored board meeting summaries, saved contract drafts and revision histories. Every file was labeled carefully: date, author, context. To Zara, it wasn't unusual behavior. Financial analysts depended on records. Decisions had consequences, and those consequences often needed to be traced backward through time. But there was another reason she began organizing the information so methodically: patterns. Zara had always been sensitive to patterns. And lately, certain patterns inside the company had begun shifting. One pattern involved Vanessa Blake. At first, Vanessa's role had been limited to media relations. But over time, she began accompanying Bradley on many of his business trips: Los Angeles, Denver, New York. Trips that once lasted 2 days occasionally stretched into 4. None of this concerned Zara in the emotional way others might expect. What interested her were the details: expense reports, hotel bookings, scheduling changes, information. One Friday evening, while reviewing financial summaries, Zara noticed that several travel expenses had been routed through discretionary accounts rather than standard operational budgets. The amounts were small, insignificant compared to the company's overall revenue. But the pattern was new. She opened the corresponding receipts: hotel suites, private dinners, transportation services unrelated to scheduled meetings. Zara closed the files and wrote a short note in her notebook. Not an accusation, just an observation. Over the following months, similar expenses appeared periodically, always during trips where Vanessa Blake had also traveled. Zara never confronted Bradley. She never mentioned Vanessa's growing presence. Instead, she continued doing what she had always done when confronted with uncertainty. She recorded the information, because Zara understood something Bradley did not. Stories built on confidence could shift quickly, but numbers once documented tended to remain where they were placed. Late one evening, months before the divorce, Bradley would eventually file. Zara sat alone in the quiet office, reviewing archived correspondence from the company's early years. The city lights shimmered across the bay outside the window. Inside her computer, years of decisions unfolded through emails and financial records. She paused on one particular file, an early investor conversation Bradley had nearly forgotten. A message referencing the company's most precarious financial moment. 3 years earlier, when Pennington Freight Solutions had come dangerously close to collapse. Zara stared at the message for a long moment before saving it into a separate folder. Then she closed the laptop. Across the city that same evening, Bradley attended a networking reception hosted by a venture capital firm. Vanessa stood beside him as he spoke confidently about the company's rapid growth. People listened. They admired the story. Bradley had become very good at telling it. But somewhere in the quiet order of Zara's records, another story still existed. One that included every email, every contract, every decision that had quietly shaped the company's survival. And one day, though Bradley could not yet imagine it, those records would speak far louder than any story he had learned to tell. The first signs of betrayal did not arrive with a dramatic discovery. There were no lipstick stains, no whispered phone calls that stopped abruptly when someone entered the room. Life rarely arranged its truths that neatly. Instead, the changes came quietly, like small shifts in a system that had once been predictable. Zara noticed them the way she noticed everything else through patterns. It began with Bradley's travel schedule. In the early years of Pennington Freight Solutions, most of Bradley's business trips followed a simple rhythm. He left early, attended meetings, returned quickly. Efficiency mattered. The company had too much work to waste time. But sometime during the 5th year, those trips began stretching longer. 2-day conferences became 4-day visits. A single client meeting suddenly justified an entire week away. At first, Zara assumed it was simply the cost of growth. The company was expanding, and Bradley's responsibilities had multiplied. But then, she noticed Vanessa Blake's name appearing beside his in the travel itineraries. Los Angeles, Austin, Chicago. The explanation was always professional. Vanessa handled public relations. Media appearances required coordination. Conference organizers preferred to work with someone experienced in communications. None of it seemed unreasonable. Not at first. Zara's curiosity did not come from suspicion. It came from data. One evening, she was reviewing quarterly expense summaries when she noticed something small but unusual. Several travel charges had been categorized under discretionary executive spending rather than the usual marketing budget. The amounts were minor. A few $100s here, $1,000 there. But the classification was different. Zara opened the individual receipts. Hotel suites, private dinners, transportation services scheduled late in the evening, long after conference events had ended. She stared at the screen for several seconds. Then, she reached for the small notebook that always rested beside her keyboard. She wrote a single line: Executive Travel Discretionary Classification Shift. No conclusions, just observation. The following month, another trip appeared in the expense reports. San Diego. Bradley and Vanessa had attended a logistics innovation summit. The official agenda lasted 2 days. The hotel charges covered 5 nights. Again, Zara opened the receipts. Again, she recorded the information. Over the next several months, the pattern repeated itself often enough that the explanation became increasingly clear. Zara never asked Bradley about it. She never searched his phone. She never confronted Vanessa in the office hallways. Because by the time the pattern had fully formed, the question no longer interested her. The answer had already appeared in the numbers. What mattered to Zara was something else. Documentation. One evening in early autumn, Bradley returned from a conference in Denver later than expected. His flight had been delayed, and by the time he entered the apartment, the city outside their windows was already quiet. Zara sat at the kitchen table reviewing shipment projections for the coming holiday season. "You're still working?" Bradley asked, dropping his suitcase near the door. "Just finishing a report." He poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. "Denver went well," he said. "A few investors are interested in expansion." Zara nodded politely. "That's good." Bradley studied her for a moment. "You don't ask many questions about the trips anymore." Zara closed her laptop gently. "Should I?" Bradley shrugged. "Most people would." Zara considered that. "I trust you to manage your work." The statement was calm, neutral. Bradley smiled faintly. "That's one of the things I've always liked about you," he said. "You're not complicated." Zara did not respond. Instead, she gathered her notebook and stood. "Good night, Bradley." Later that evening, after Bradley had gone to sleep, Zara returned to the living room and opened her laptop again. She navigated through the company's internal archives and created a new folder: Executive Travel Documentation. Inside it, she saved copies of every receipt, invoice, and itinerary associated with Bradley's recent trips. She included timestamps, locations, expense classifications. Nothing dramatic, just information. Across town the next morning, the atmosphere inside Pennington Freight Solutions remained energetic. The company had recently secured another major contract with a chain of electronics retailers across California. Employees celebrated the news with catered lunches and excited conversations about future expansion. Bradley moved confidently through the office, shaking hands, accepting congratulations. Vanessa Blake stood near the conference room, discussing an upcoming media interview with him. Thomas Avery watched the interaction from across the hallway. He had worked long enough in corporate environments to recognize subtle dynamics between colleagues. The proximity, the quiet familiarity, the way Vanessa laughed slightly longer than necessary at Bradley's comments. Thomas said nothing. It wasn't his responsibility. Later that afternoon, Zara passed through the office on her way to review warehouse data with the operations team. As she walked past Bradley's office, she noticed Vanessa sitting inside with him. The door was partially closed. Their conversation stopped when Zara appeared in the hallway. Vanessa stood. "Zara," she said brightly. "Bradley was just telling me about the early days of the company." Zara looked at Bradley briefly. "I'm sure he tells it well," Bradley laughed. "She's being modest," he said to Vanessa. "Zara's always preferred the background." Vanessa nodded approvingly. Every company needs someone steady behind the scenes. Zara did not disagree. Instead, she continued down the hallway. Inside the conference room, Thomas Avery glanced up from his paperwork as she entered. "Everything okay?" he asked. Zara sat across from him and opened a folder containing updated freight projections. "Operations look stable," she replied. Thomas studied her expression for a moment. He had the strange feeling that she understood far more about the company's internal dynamics than she ever revealed. But Zara returned her attention to the spreadsheets. Numbers first, people later. That evening, as the office emptied and the city lights began reflecting off the bay, Zara remained at her desk organizing the documentation she had collected over the past year. Emails, expense reports, travel confirmations. She wasn't gathering evidence for revenge. That idea never interested her. What interested her was clarity. Human relationships were often messy, shaped by emotions that shifted without warning. But financial systems required order. Records preserved that order. Across the city, Bradley met Vanessa for dinner at a restaurant overlooking the marina. Their conversation moved easily between work and personal topics. To Bradley, the evening felt like freedom. Success had opened new possibilities in his life, and he embraced them without much reflection. He never considered the possibility that somewhere else in the city, Zara was quietly preserving the financial footprints of every decision he made. Because Bradley still believed the same story he had been telling for years, that he had built everything himself, that the systems beneath the company's success were simple, that Zara's silence meant she was unaware. In time, he would discover how wrong those assumptions were. But for now, the patterns continued forming quietly inside spreadsheets and folders. And Zara Pennington continued doing exactly what she had always done: observing, recording, and waiting for the moment when information patiently gathered over time would become impossible for anyone to ignore. The meeting with the lawyer happened on a gray Tuesday morning in San Francisco. Zara chose the time carefully. Midweek, late morning. A slot when Bradley was scheduled to be in Los Angeles speaking at a logistics conference. His calendar had been public within the company for weeks, which made the decision easy. The law office of Margaret Holloway occupied the 12th floor of a quiet building several blocks from the courthouse. The space was understated soft lighting, dark wooden shelves, and framed certificates arranged neatly along the walls. Nothing about the office suggested drama. It suggested precision. Margaret Holloway had practiced family law in California for nearly 25 years. Her reputation was unusual among divorce attorneys. She wasn't known for theatrical courtroom battles or sensational settlements. She was known for something else: preparation. Clients who arrived at Margaret's office expecting emotional reassurance often left with a stack of document requests and a clear understanding that facts mattered more than feelings. When Zara arrived, the receptionist greeted her politely and led her into a small conference room overlooking Market Street. Margaret entered a few minutes later carrying a tablet and a legal pad. She was in her early 50s with calm eyes and the measured composure of someone who had watched hundreds of marriages unravel in similar ways. Mrs. Pennington, she said, shaking Zara's hand. Zara is fine. Margaret sat down across the table. All right then, Zara, what brings you here today? Zara did not hesitate. My husband is having an affair, she said quietly. Margaret didn't react with surprise. In her line of work, such statements rarely arrived without warning. Do you want to file for divorce? Margaret asked. Zara paused before answering. I don't know yet. Margaret folded her hands. That's a reasonable place to start. For a moment, the room was silent, except for the distant sounds of traffic below. Then Margaret asked the question she asked every new client. Are you here because you want revenge, or because you want clarity? Zara considered the words carefully. I want the record to be accurate, she replied. Margaret studied her for a moment. Most clients arrived angry, hurt, eager to explain every betrayal in detail. Zara's calm tone was different. Tell me about your marriage, Margaret said. Zara spoke slowly, describing the history of Pennington Freight Solutions, the early years, the spreadsheets, the financial models, the move to San Francisco. She explained how the company had grown and how Bradley had gradually become its public face. Margaret listened without interrupting, occasionally writing brief notes. When Zara finished, Margaret asked a simple question. Do you own any part of the company? Zara nodded. Yes. How much? Zara opened the folders she had brought with her. Inside were several printed documents, early financial projections, shareholder agreements, bank transfer records. Margaret leaned forward slightly as Zara placed the first document on the table. This is the original capital structure, Zara explained. From the second year of operations, Margaret scanned the page. Bradley Pennington, majority founder shares. She looked up. And you? Zara slid another document across the table. Margaret read silently for several seconds. Then her eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly. Pennington Strategic Trust, she said slowly. Yes. Margaret glanced back at Zara. You control this trust, yes. Margaret sat back in her chair. How much equity does it hold? 37%. For the first time since entering the room, Margaret Holloway showed clear interest. That's significant. Zara nodded. It was created during a capital crisis 3 years ago. Margaret flipped through the rest of the documents. Wire transfers, investment agreements, trust formation paperwork. Everything appeared carefully organized. Who funded the trust? Margaret asked. Zara answered calmly. Arthur Whitmore. Margaret stopped turning pages. Arthur Whitmore, she repeated. Zara nodded. You know him, Margaret exhaled slowly. Most people in finance know him. He's extremely private. Arthur Whitmore was not a venture capitalist in the traditional sense. He rarely appeared in public business circles, and he almost never spoke to the press. But his investments, quiet, carefully chosen, had helped launch several highly successful companies over the past 2 decades. Margaret looked again at the wire transfer document. $2.5 million. 3 years earlier. This capital saved the company, she asked. Yes. And Bradley agreed to the trust structure. Zara nodded again. He signed the investment documents. Margaret tapped the page thoughtfully. Did he read them? Zara answered honestly. I don't believe he did carefully. Margaret allowed herself a small smile. That happens more often than you'd think. She closed the folder and leaned forward. Does your husband know that the trust exists? Yes. Does he understand that it gives you control of 37% of the company? Zara shook her head. I don't think he understands the implications. Margaret was silent for a moment. Then she asked the most important question of the morning. Zara, are you planning to divorce Bradley? Zara looked out the window toward the busy street below. I believe he plans to divorce me. Margaret nodded slowly. That would simplify things. Zara turned back toward her. I'm not interested in destroying the company, she said. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Most people in your position would be. The company employs over 100 people now, Zara replied. Their jobs matter more than my personal situation. Margaret studied her again. "You're unusual." Zara didn't respond. Margaret opened her legal pad and began writing. "Here's what we're going to do," she said. "First, we secure copies of every document related to the trust and the investment. Originals, if possible." Zara nodded. "I already have them." Margaret smiled slightly. "I suspected you might." Second, Margaret continued, "We establish a complete financial timeline of the company's growth before and after the Whitmore investment. I can provide that." Third, Margaret said, tapping her pen against the paper. "We wait." Zara tilted her head slightly. "Wait," Margaret nodded. "Yes. In situations like this, the person who believes they have all the power usually makes the first move." And Bradley Margaret smiled again. He sounds exactly like the type who will. The meeting ended an hour later. As Zara gathered her documents, Margaret walked her to the door. "Zara," she said, "yes, when the time comes, and it will, the most powerful thing you can do is remain exactly as calm as you've been today." Zara nodded. "That shouldn't be difficult." Margaret watched her leave. Some clients carried anger like a storm cloud behind them. Zara Pennington carried something else entirely: information. And Margaret Holloway knew from long experience that information, when preserved carefully and revealed at the right moment, could change the outcome of an entire courtroom. 3 months later, Bradley Pennington would file for divorce. And when he did, he would do so with absolute confidence that Zara Pennington had nothing. Margaret already knew how wrong that assumption was. 3 years before the divorce filing, before Bradley Pennington had grown fully comfortable with the story, he told the world Pennington Freight Solutions had nearly collapsed. The crisis had arrived quietly. At the time, the company was still operating out of its first San Francisco office. The relocation from Seattle had been expensive. Rent hiring costs and the expansion of the logistics network had strained the company's finances more than Bradley expected. Several contracts that Bradley believed were certain to close were delayed unexpectedly. One retailer postponed its partnership for 6 months. Another withdrew entirely after a change in leadership. Cash flow began tightening. Zara noticed the pattern long before Bradley did. Inside her forecasting models, the numbers told a clear story. If revenue didn't stabilize within 90 days, the company would begin missing its financial obligations. Payroll, vendor payments, insurance. The system she had built was designed to warn of exactly this kind of risk. One evening, she sat alone in the office, reviewing the projections again and again, adjusting assumptions to see if there was any scenario where the company could survive without outside capital. Each version of the spreadsheet reached the same conclusion. They needed new funding, and quickly. Bradley, however, believed the problem was temporary. "We've had slow quarters before," he told her one night while pacing across the living room. "The next contract will close. It always does." Zara didn't argue. Instead, she opened her laptop and showed him the forecast. "If the Riverside contract doesn't close within 6 weeks," she said calmly, "we'll have to reduce payroll." Bradley frowned. "That's not happening. Then we need capital." Bradley rubbed his forehead. "I've already spoken to 2 venture firms. They're interested, but they want a larger equity stake than I'm willing to give." "How large?" 25%. Zara looked back at the screen. "At the current burn rate, that may be necessary." Bradley shook his head. "I didn't build this company just to hand it over to investors." Zara closed the laptop slowly. "Then we should consider other options." Bradley exhaled. Like what Zara hesitated for a moment before answering. "There may be someone I can call." Bradley looked at her curiously. "You know investors?" Zara nodded slightly. "My father worked with someone years ago, a private investor." "What kind of investor?" "The careful kind." Bradley leaned back on the couch. "If he's that careful, he probably won't want to invest in a company that's bleeding cash." Zara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reopened her laptop and began writing an email. The recipient's name appeared at the top of the screen: Arthur Whitmore, Arthur Whitmore had built his fortune quietly through a series of investments in infrastructure and transportation companies during the 1990s and early 2000s. Unlike most venture capitalists, Arthur avoided public attention. He rarely attended conferences, never gave interviews, and preferred to work through small, trusted networks of contacts. Zara had met him only twice when she was younger. Both times had been during quiet dinners her father hosted when Arthur visited Portland for business. Arthur had asked her questions about her studies, about numbers, about logistics. Years later, she wasn't certain he would even remember her. But the email she wrote that night was direct. She explained the company's situation. She attached a summary of the financial models she had built. And she ended with a simple sentence. "If you believe the system has potential, I would appreciate the opportunity to speak with you." She sent the message and closed the laptop. Bradley didn't ask about the email again. He assumed it would lead nowhere. 2 days later, Zara received a reply. The message was short. "Zara, I remember your father mentioning your work in logistics. Your analysis is thoughtful. Let's talk." Arthur. The call lasted 40 minutes. Arthur's voice was calm and deliberate. He asked detailed questions about the company's operations, fuel pricing strategies, delivery reliability metrics, the scalability of Zara's route optimization model. Zara answered each one carefully. When the call ended, Arthur spoke one final sentence. "I'd like to see the company in person." A week later, Arthur Whitmore visited the San Francisco office. He arrived without an assistant, wearing a dark overcoat and carrying a simple leather briefcase. Bradley greeted him enthusiastically. "Mr. Whitmore, it's great to meet you." Arthur shook his hand politely. "Please call me Arthur." They sat together in the conference room overlooking the bay. For nearly 2 hours, Arthur listened as Bradley described the company's growth strategy. Bradley spoke with the same confidence he displayed in every investor meeting. When he finished, Arthur turned toward Zara. "I'd like to see the operational models." Zara connected her laptop to the conference room screen. The spreadsheets appeared. Arthur studied them in silence. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Occasionally, he asked a quiet question. "Where did you derive this demand variance coefficient?" "How stable are your fuel hedging assumptions?" Zara answered each one. Bradley sat quietly beside them, watching the exchange. Finally, Arthur closed the laptop. "The system is sound," he said. Bradley leaned forward. "So you're interested in investing?" Arthur nodded. "Yes." Relief spread across Bradley's face. "That's fantastic." Arthur raised a hand slightly. "But I have one condition." Bradley nodded quickly. "Of course." Arthur looked at Zara. "The equity from my investment will be placed in a trust." Bradley blinked. "A trust," Arthur continued calmly. "The trust will hold the shares. Zara will manage it." Bradley hesitated. "That's unusual." Arthur shrugged lightly. "It protects the investment." Zara understood immediately. Arthur wasn't just investing in the company. He was investing in the systems she had built. "How much capital are you offering?" Bradley asked. $2.5 million. The number filled the room with silence. At the company's current stage, the amount was more than enough to stabilize operations and fund expansion for at least 2 years. "What equity percentage?" Bradley asked carefully. Arthur answered without hesitation. 37%. Bradley frowned. "That's a significant stake." Arthur met his gaze calmly. "So is the risk." Bradley looked toward Zara. She said nothing. The decision rested with him. After several seconds, Bradley nodded. "All right." Arthur extended his hand. "Then we have an agreement." The legal documents were drafted the following week. The investment was wired shortly after. Pennington Freight Solutions stabilized almost immediately. New contracts arrived within months. The company expanded its delivery network across California. And gradually, as success returned, the memory of that financial crisis faded from Bradley's daily thinking. The trust documents remained filed quietly among the company's legal records. Bradley signed them without studying every clause. To him, they were simply another step in the process of growing the company. But for Zara and for Arthur Whitmore, the structure had always been intentional. 3 years later, in a courtroom where Bradley Pennington would confidently declare that his wife had built nothing, those same documents would become far more important than he ever imagined. Because sometimes the most significant decisions in a company's history were made not during moments of triumph, but during quiet meetings, when survival depended on trusting the person who understood the numbers best. The divorce filing arrived on a Monday morning, not through a conversation, not through a quiet acknowledgement that something had changed between them. It arrived the way Bradley Pennington handled most difficult things, through paperwork prepared by someone else. Zara received the notification at 9:12 a.m. while sitting in her office reviewing a logistics variance report from the company's Sacramento distribution hub. The email came from a courier service that specialized in legal document delivery. The subject line was neutral. Service notification. Legal filing. She opened it without urgency. Attached was a scanned copy of the official petition filed in the Superior Court of California. Petitioner Bradley James Pennington. Respondent Zara Pennington. Grounds irreconcilable differences. Zara read the document once calmly, then closed the file. There was no visible reaction. No sudden anger, no shock. Only a quiet moment where she leaned back slightly in her chair and looked out through the glass wall of her office at the busy floor of Pennington Freight Solutions. Employees moved between desks. Phones rang. Conversations drifted through the open workspace. Life inside the company continued exactly as it had the day before. Only the legal structure surrounding Zara's marriage had changed. She reached for her notebook and wrote a single line. Bradley filed first, then she closed the notebook. Across the office, Bradley was not present. He was in Los Angeles again this time, attending a transportation technology summit where he was scheduled to speak about the future of freight logistics. The timing of the filing had not been accidental. Bradley preferred distance when delivering unpleasant news. 3 hours later, Zara received a call. The name on the screen read, Margaret Holloway. "I saw the filing," Margaret said calmly when Zara answered. "Yes. Are you surprised?" Margaret paused. "That makes things easier." Zara glanced again at the printed copy of the petition now resting on her desk. "What happens next?" she asked. Margaret's voice remained steady. "Bradley believes he controls the narrative right now. He filed first, which gives him the illusion of momentum." "An illusion, yes." Margaret paused briefly before continuing. "He also appears to believe that you have no independent financial leverage." Zara didn't respond. Margaret continued. "That belief will guide every decision he makes from this point forward." Zara nodded slightly, even though Margaret couldn't see her. "Then we should let him continue believing it." Margaret allowed herself a small smile on the other end of the line. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." The official documents arrived at the apartment that evening. A courier knocked shortly after 6. Bradley was still out of town. Zara signed for the envelope and placed it on the kitchen table without opening it again. She already knew what it contained. Later that night, Bradley called. His tone was unusually casual. "Hey," he said, "did you get the paperwork today?" "Yes." Silence lingered for a moment. Bradley cleared his throat. "I figured this would be the cleanest way to handle things." Zara listened without interrupting. "I think we both know the marriage hasn't been working for a while," Bradley continued. "That may be true." Bradley seemed relieved that she wasn't arguing. "I'm glad you see it that way." "What do you expect from the divorce?" Zara asked calmly. Bradley exhaled. "Honestly, I'd prefer to keep it simple." "Simple how? Well, the company stays with me, obviously." Zara remained silent. Bradley continued speaking, filling the quiet space. "You've never really been involved in the operational side of things anyway. It'll be easier if we just keep the business structure intact." Zara understood the assumption immediately. Bradley believed the company was entirely his. He believed Zara's role had always been informal, advisory, domestic, invisible. "I see," she said. Bradley relaxed slightly. "I'll make sure you're taken care of," he added. "A settlement, some financial support. You won't have to worry about anything." Zara looked down at the documents on the table. "I appreciate the concern," she said quietly. They ended the call shortly afterward. Neither of them raised their voice. Neither of them argued. But the distance between their understanding of reality had never been greater. Over the next few weeks, Bradley began shaping the narrative of the divorce the same way he shaped the public narrative of the company. Confidently, carefully, and always in ways that positioned him as the central figure. Inside the office, a few senior employees eventually learned about the separation. Bradley explained the situation during a brief conversation with the executive team. "Zara and I have grown apart," he said. "It happens." Thomas Avery listened without comment. Bradley continued. "She's not involved in the business anyway, so the transition should be straightforward." Thomas glanced down at the financial reports in front of him. Straightforward. That was an interesting word. Later that afternoon, he knocked lightly on Zara's office door. She looked up from her computer. "Come in." Thomas closed the door behind him. "I heard about the divorce filing," he said. "Yes." He hesitated. "Bradley believes the company won't be affected." Lara tilted her head slightly. "Does he?" Thomas studied her expression. "You don't seem worried." Zara returned her attention to the spreadsheet on her screen. Worry rarely improves outcomes. Thomas considered that answer. "You've always been very calm about things," he said. Zara didn't reply. Instead, she opened another folder on her computer. Inside were documents Margaret Holloway had already reviewed. Trust agreements, wire transfers, board approvals. Thomas didn't see the screen. He simply noticed that Zara looked exactly the same as she always had. Focused, precise. "Is there anything you need from me?" he asked. Zara thought for a moment. "Yes." Thomas waited. "When the time comes," she said, "I may need you to confirm certain financial timelines." Thomas nodded slowly. Understood. He left the office with a growing sense that the story unfolding around the company was far more complicated than Bradley realized. Meanwhile, Bradley continued moving forward with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. His lawyer, Daniel Reeves, a sharp and aggressive divorce attorney, shared that confidence. During their first strategy meeting, Daniel flipped through the financial overview Bradley had provided. "So your wife doesn't hold equity in the company directly?" Daniel asked. "No. And she hasn't been an employee." Daniel leaned back. "Then this should be fairly clean." Bradley smiled. "That's what I thought." Daniel nodded. "She'll probably request spousal support, maybe a modest settlement. But from a business perspective, you're in control." Bradley relaxed. For weeks, he had assumed exactly that. Across the city, Zara sat quietly in Margaret Holloway's office, reviewing the same set of financial documents they had discussed months earlier. Margaret tapped the trust agreement lightly. "He still believes the company belongs entirely to him?" she asked. "Yes," Margaret nodded. "Then we continue exactly as planned." Zara closed the folder. "Patience." Margaret smiled. "Patience." Because somewhere inside a quiet legal filing, supported by contracts Bradley had barely read 3 years earlier, a different version of reality was waiting. And when the divorce proceedings finally reached the courtroom, that reality would appear with the calm certainty of numbers that had never changed. By the time the divorce filing became public among Bradley Pennington's professional circle, the story had already begun to change. Not the legal story, the narrative. Bradley had always understood the power of a well-constructed narrative. It was the same skill that helped him raise investment capital, attract clients, and position Pennington Freight Solutions as an emerging force in the logistics industry. Now he applied that same instinct to the end of his marriage. At first, the conversations were casual. At a private dinner with several investors in Palo Alto, Bradley mentioned the divorce while discussing upcoming company expansions. "Zara and I are separating," he said with a shrug that suggested mild inconvenience. rather than emotional upheaval. One of the investors raised an eyebrow. Complicated situation? Bradley shook his head. Not really. She was never involved in the business. Mostly stayed home. The statement passed easily across the table. No one questioned it. Why would they? For years, Bradley had been the visible architect of the company's growth. He appeared in interviews, led conference panels, and negotiated contracts. Most of the investors at the table had never spoken to Zara directly. Their understanding of the company mirrored the story Bradley had always told. Founder, visionary, self-made success. Across town that same evening, Zara sat in the quiet living room of the apartment she and Bradley still technically shared. The divorce paperwork rested on the coffee table beside her laptop. She was reviewing operational reports from the company's Nevada shipping routes. The system she had built years earlier continued functioning exactly as intended. Fuel variance remained within projected limits. Delivery reliability across the Western distribution network was stable. Numbers rarely changed simply because a marriage had ended. The next morning, Bradley appeared in the office earlier than usual. He had a meeting scheduled with Vanessa Blake and the company's marketing team. The agenda focused on expanding Pennington Freight Solutions' media presence before an upcoming national logistics conference. Vanessa stood at the front of the conference room, flipping through a digital presentation. If we position you as the face of regional logistics innovation, she said, we can leverage the divorce narrative carefully. Bradley leaned back in his chair. The divorce narrative. Vanessa nodded calmly. Personal stories humanize founders. If we frame it as you dedicating everything to building the company, even sacrificing your marriage, it strengthens the image. Bradley considered that for a moment. That sounds dramatic. Vanessa smiled slightly. People respond to drama. Bradley shrugged. All right, as long as it doesn't affect the business. Vanessa nodded. The key is consistency. You built the company. You sacrificed personal stability to grow it. That's the message. Across the table, Thomas Avery listened quietly. He had been invited to the meeting only to review financial projections related to expansion plans. But the conversation had shifted towards something else entirely. Narrative management. Thomas had worked long enough in corporate finance to understand how public perception influenced investor confidence. But the simplicity of Bradley's story unsettled him slightly, because he knew something most outsiders didn't. The operational systems supporting the company were not Bradley's creation. They were Zara's. Later that afternoon, Thomas passed Zara in the hallway near the accounting offices. Do you have a moment, he asked. Zara nodded. They stepped into a small meeting room. Thomas closed the door. I attended the marketing strategy meeting this morning, he said. Zara waited patiently. They're planning to position Bradley as the sole architect of the company's growth. Zara tilted her head slightly. That isn't new. Thomas hesitated. They're also discussing the divorce publicly. Zara showed no reaction. Thomas continued. The story they're telling suggests you had little involvement in the business. Zara looked at him calmly. Does that concern you? Thomas thought about the question. From a financial perspective, yes. Why? Because the company's actual structure doesn't match that narrative. Zara nodded slightly. That's true. Thomas studied her expression carefully. You're remarkably calm about all of this. Zara folded her hands on the table. Stories change, she said quietly. Records usually don't. Thomas understood the meaning immediately. You've kept everything, yes. Emails, contracts, investment documents, board approvals. Zara had preserved the company's real history with the same careful attention she applied to financial models. Thus, Thomas exhaled slowly. Bradley has no idea, does he know? The room fell silent. Finally, Thomas spoke again. If the situation reaches court, it will. Thomas nodded. And when it does, Zara met his gaze. The truth will be documented. Meanwhile, Larissa and Bradley continued refining the public version of events. During a podcast interview later that week, the host asked a casual question about balancing entrepreneurship with personal life. Bradley laughed lightly. "Well, my wife and I are actually going through a divorce right now," he said. "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that," the host replied. Bradley waved the concern away. "It happens. Building a company takes everything you have. Some people aren't built for that life." The statement passed without challenge. Listeners heard only what Bradley intended them to hear: dedication, sacrifice, success. Across the city, Margaret Holloway listened to the same podcast recording later that evening. She turned the volume down and glanced at Zara, who sat across from her reviewing a stack of legal filings. "He's making your role sound very small," Margaret said. Zara closed the folder she was reading. "Small things can still matter." Margaret smiled faintly. "That's a very restrained way of putting it." She slid another document across the desk. "This is the financial disclosure Bradley's attorney submitted this week." Zara scanned the pages. Assets, company valuation, personal accounts. Everything appeared exactly as Bradley's legal team believed it to be. Margaret tapped the page listing company ownership. "He claims full operational control and majority equity." Zara nodded. "That's his understanding." Margaret leaned back in her chair. "And you're comfortable letting him believe that for now?" Margaret closed the folder. "I've handled hundreds of divorces," she said slowly. "Very few involve this level of patience." Zara didn't respond. Margaret continued. "When the hearing begins, his attorney will likely argue that you contributed little to the business." "Yes, and Bradley will probably say the same thing." Zara's voice remained steady. "Then they will have the opportunity to explain that claim under oath." Margaret watched her carefully. There was no bitterness in Zara's tone, no anger, only certainty. And Margaret understood something Bradley did not. Confidence built on incomplete information could be extremely fragile. In a few weeks, the divorce proceedings would begin. Bradley Pennington would walk into that courtroom believing the story he had repeated so often that it had become truth in his own mind. But somewhere inside a set of legal documents, he barely remembered signing another version of that truth had been waiting quietly for years. And when it finally appeared, the narrative Bradley had built so carefully would begin to unravel one verified record at a time. Preparation for a courtroom rarely begins inside the courtroom itself. It begins in offices filled with paper. In quiet rooms where conversations are measured carefully and every sentence is tested against documents that cannot afford to be wrong. For Zara Pennington, preparation had begun years earlier. For Margaret Holloway, it began the moment Bradley filed for divorce. On a rainy Thursday morning, Zara arrived at Margaret's office, carrying a slim leather folder. Inside were documents she had already reviewed dozens of times. Margaret was waiting at the conference table with several additional stacks of paperwork arranged neatly in front of her. "Good timing," Margaret said as Zara sat down. "Did something change?" Zara asked. Margaret slid a printed email across the table. "This arrived from Daniel Reeves yesterday evening." Daniel Reeves was Bradley's attorney, sharp, aggressive, and widely known for representing wealthy clients in high-profile divorces. Zara read the message silently. Daniel's request was simple, a preliminary disclosure of Zara's personal financial assets. Margaret watched her finish reading. "They believe you have very little," Margaret said. Zara placed the paper back on the table. "That would be consistent with Bradley's assumptions." Margaret nodded. "Yes, which gives us a small advantage." She reached for another folder. "This is where we start documenting the real structure." Inside were copies of the documents Zara had first shown Margaret months earlier. Trust agreements, wire transfers, equity allocation records. Margaret opened the trust formation document and turned it toward Zara. "Let's review everything again carefully," she said. Zara didn't object. Accuracy mattered. Margaret tapped the first page. "Pennington Strategic Trust. Created 3 years ago. Yes. Primary beneficiary and managing trustee, Zara Pennington. Yes." Margaret turned to the next document. The Whitmore investment. $2.5 million wired into company accounts. She slid the wire transfer confirmation forward. The investment secured 37% equity through the trust. Zara nodded. Margaret leaned back slightly. Which means the company's ownership structure is very different from what Bradley's attorney believes. She picked up another document. According to Daniel Reeves' filing, Bradley believes he maintains controlling interest. He does, Zara said calmly. Margaret looked up. That surprises you? No, Zara replied. Bradley always held the largest individual share. Margaret smiled slightly. Yes, but there's a difference between majority ownership and operational control. Zara understood the distinction. 37% was not a majority, but it was enough to shift power dramatically, especially if combined with board influence. Margaret flipped to another document. This is the board structure at the time of the Whitmore investment. Zara studied the page. 5 members, Bradley, Zara, Thomas Avery, and 2 independent advisors. Margaret tapped the signature line near the bottom. This clause gives the trust the right to appoint a board representative if necessary. Zara remembered. Arthur Whitmore had insisted on that provision. At the time, Bradley had barely glanced at the legal language before signing. Margaret closed the folder slowly. Daniel Reeves doesn't know about this yet. Zara folded her hands. He will. Yes, Margaret said calmly, but timing matters. Across the city, Daniel Reeves sat in a polished downtown office reviewing Bradley's financial disclosures. The documents painted a simple picture. Bradley Pennington, founder and CEO of Pennington Freight Solutions, owned the majority of the company's shares. His wife, according to the records Daniel had seen so far, had no direct salary from the company and no official executive title. Daniel had handled hundreds of divorces involving wealthy business owners. The pattern was familiar. One spouse built the company. The other supported the household. Dividing assets usually meant calculating company value, negotiating settlement terms, and ensuring that operational control remained with the founder. Daniel leaned back in his chair. This will be straightforward, he told Bradley during a phone call that afternoon. Bradley sounded relieved. I thought so too. Daniel flipped through the documents again. Your wife will likely claim that she contributed informally to the business. That's common. She helped with spreadsheets early on, Bradley admitted. Daniel smiled faintly. Early startup assistance rarely translates into ownership rights. Bradley nodded. That's what I figured. Daniel closed the file. We'll push for a quick settlement. Across the bay, Margaret Holloway placed several new documents on the table in front of Zara. These are the bank records we'll submit during financial discovery. Zara studied the statements. Each page showed the same transfer. Whitmore Capital Holdings, $2,500,000. Margaret tapped the entry. This money entered the company through the trust. Yes, which means it wasn't Bradley's personal capital. Zara nodded again. Margaret continued. And because the trust holds the equity tied to that investment, you legally control those shares. She paused before adding something else. And those shares represent 37% of the company. The number lingered in the quiet room. Margaret leaned forward. Once Daniel Reeves sees this, his entire strategy will change. Zara asked the only question that mattered. When do we show it? Margaret smiled slightly. In court. Zara didn't react. Margaret continued. If we present it during discovery, they'll have weeks to adjust their narrative. But if we wait, then Bradley will walk into that courtroom believing he has already won. Zara understood. Patience had always been part of the plan. Margaret gathered the documents into a new folder labeled Court Exhibits Preliminary. These records are clean, she said. Every transfer documented. Every signature verified. Zara glanced once more at the trust agreement. 3 years earlier, the document had simply been a financial safeguard. Now it had become something else. Evidence. Across the city that same evening, Bradley attended another networking dinner with potential investors interested in expanding Pennington Freight Solutions into the Midwest. Over drinks, one of the investors asked casually about the divorce. Bradley shrugged. Nothing complicated, he said. We're working out the details. And the company. Still mine, Bradley replied confidently. The investors nodded. That was the answer they expected. Bradley had repeated the story often enough that it felt completely true. He had built the company. He had raised the capital. He had led its growth. From his perspective, Zara had simply been present during the journey. Across town, Zara sat quietly in her apartment, reviewing the same documents Margaret had just organized for the court. Wire transfers, trust agreements, board minutes, records that had existed quietly for years, records Bradley barely remembered signing. Zara closed the folder and placed it beside her laptop. Outside, the city lights reflected across the bay. Inside those pages rested something stronger than any story Bradley had told investors or reporters. Proof. And when the courtroom doors finally opened, proof would matter far more than confidence. The first court hearing took place on a clear Tuesday morning in downtown San Francisco. The courthouse stood like most government buildings did, solid, quiet, and indifferent to the stories that passed through its rooms every day. Divorce hearings were routine here. Arguments over property money and broken marriages unfolded constantly inside its walls. But the people involved rarely saw their cases as routine. Bradley Pennington arrived 20 minutes early. He stepped out of a black sedan, wearing a tailored navy suit, the same kind he often wore during investor meetings. His confidence had not faded since filing for divorce. If anything, the weeks of preparation with his attorney had strengthened it. Beside him walked Daniel Reeves, his lawyer. Daniel carried a leather briefcase and moved with the calm efficiency of someone who had stood inside many courtrooms and rarely felt surprised by what happened inside them. You look relaxed, Daniel said as they walked through the courthouse entrance. Bradley adjusted his cuff. I am. Daniel gave a small approving nod. That helps. Security was quick. Within minutes, they were moving through the quiet hallway outside the assigned courtroom. Several people were already waiting. Other couples, other attorneys. Divorce proceedings rarely occupied the entire courtroom schedule, so multiple cases were often scheduled within the same morning. Bradley leaned casually against the wall. You think she'll try anything dramatic? He asked. Daniel shook his head. Unlikely. Most spouses in this situation request financial settlement terms and move on. Bradley nodded. That's what I thought. A few minutes later, the elevator doors opened at the far end of the hallway. Zara stepped out. She wore a simple charcoal coat and carried a slim folder in her hand. Beside her walked Margaret Holloway, calm as always. Bradley noticed them immediately. For a moment, his expression softened slightly, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of memory. But the moment passed quickly. Zara walked toward the courtroom without looking at him. Her pace was steady, not rushed, not hesitant. Bradley straightened. That's her attorney, he asked quietly. Daniel glanced up. Yes, Margaret Holloway. Bradley frowned slightly. You know her, Daniel's voice lowered. She's very good, Bradley shrugged. That's fine. Daniel didn't respond. Across the hallway, Margaret leaned toward Zara as they approached the courtroom door. Remember, she said quietly, we're not here to argue today. Zara nodded. Just establish the record. Exactly. The bailiff opened the courtroom doors a few minutes later. Everyone entered. Inside, the room looked almost identical to every courtroom built in California. Over the past 50 years, high ceilings, wooden benches, the raised platform where the judge would sit. Judge Eleanor Matthews presided over the session that morning. She was known among attorneys for being efficient and patient, but not particularly tolerant of unnecessary theatrics. When the clerk called the Pennington case, Bradley and Zara moved to opposite sides of the courtroom. Bradley sat beside Daniel, Zara beside Margaret. For a moment the room was silent, except for the quiet rustling of papers. Judge Matthews looked down from the bench. Case number 22, 4,817. Pennington versus Pennington. Both attorneys stood, Daniel Reeves spoke first. Your Honor, Bradley Pennington is the petitioner in this matter. Margaret nodded slightly. Zara Pennington for the respondent. Judge Matthews adjusted her glasses and glanced at the documents in front of her. This is a preliminary hearing regarding financial disclosures and marital property. Both attorneys confirmed. The judge turned toward Daniel. Mr. Reeves, you may begin. Daniel stepped forward confidently. Your Honor, this case is relatively straightforward. He gestured briefly toward Bradley. My client is the founder and primary operator of Pennington Freight Solutions, a logistics company headquartered in San Francisco. The judge nodded. Daniel continued. Throughout the marriage, Mr. Pennington maintained responsibility for the company's development, financing, and management. He paused slightly before continuing. Mrs. Pennington did not hold an official executive role within the company. Across the courtroom, Zara remained perfectly still. Daniel continued presenting his argument. The petitioner intends to maintain operational control of the company following the divorce. Judge Matthews looked toward Margaret. Miss Holloway. Margaret rose calmly. We acknowledge that Mr. Pennington currently manages the company, Your Honor. Daniel relaxed slightly. Margaret continued. However, the financial structure of the company is more complex than the petitioner's statement suggests. Daniel's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Judge Matthews looked interested. How so? Margaret did not answer immediately. Instead, she placed a folder on the podium. Your Honor, we intend to present documentation regarding equity distribution during the discovery phase. Daniel stepped forward slightly. Your Honor, if there are claims regarding ownership, we would request those disclosures now. Margaret smiled politely. They will be provided at the appropriate time. Judge Matthews studied both attorneys. This hearing concerns preliminary disclosures only. She turned toward Zara briefly. Mrs. Pennington, do you currently hold employment within the company? Zara answered calmly. No, Your Honor. Do you receive a salary from the company? Daniel allowed himself a quiet breath. The answers matched exactly what he expected. Judge Matthews made a brief note. Very well. The hearing continued with routine procedural discussions, timelines for financial discovery, document submissions, and scheduling for future sessions. Nothing dramatic occurred. No raised voices, no accusations, just legal structure moving forward. But as the proceedings ended, Judge Matthews made one final remark while reviewing the file. I expect full transparency from both parties regarding business ownership, she said. Daniel nodded confidently. Of course, Your Honor. Margaret gave the same answer. When the hearing concluded, the courtroom slowly emptied. Bradley stood and gathered his papers. That went well, he said quietly to Daniel. Daniel nodded. Yes. But his expression was thoughtful. Across the room, Zara closed her folder and stood. Margaret leaned toward her. They're comfortable, Margaret whispered. Zara looked toward Bradley briefly. Yes. Margaret allowed herself a small smile. That makes the next hearing more interesting. Bradley never heard the comment. He was already walking toward the hallway with Daniel convinced that the case was unfolding exactly as expected. The first hearing had confirmed everything he believed. Zara had no salary, no executive title, no visible role in the company's management. From Bradley's perspective, the story remained exactly the same. He had built the company. He controlled it. And after the divorce, nothing about that would change. What he didn't realize was that the most important documents in the entire case had not yet been mentioned inside that courtroom. They were still sitting quietly inside Margaret Holloway's folder, waiting. Confidence can become dangerous when it goes unchallenged for too long. In the weeks following the preliminary hearing, Bradley Pennington's confidence grew stronger. From his perspective, everything about the case was unfolding exactly as expected. The first hearing had confirmed what he already believed: Zara had no official role in Pennington Freight Solutions. She held no salary, no executive title, and had not attempted to publicly dispute his control of the company. To Bradley, her silence looked like surrender, and people who believed they were winning often spoke more freely than they should. One evening, about 3 weeks before the next court appearance, Bradley attended a private business reception in Palo Alto. The event was organized by a venture capital firm that had expressed interest in funding logistics infrastructure projects. The gathering took place in a glass-walled conference space overlooking the Stanford campus. Investors, startup founders, and consultants moved through the room holding glasses of wine while discussing deals and expansion plans. Bradley moved easily through the crowd. Conversations flowed naturally when people already believed you were successful. At one point, a venture partner named Elliot Grant approached him. "I heard about the divorce," Elliot said casually. Bradley shrugged. "Yeah, one of those things. Messy, not really." Bradley took a sip from his drink before continuing. "She never really had anything to do with the business anyway." Elliot nodded. "That simplifies things." Bradley smiled slightly. "Exactly." Nearby, Vanessa Blake joined the conversation. She had attended the reception as part of her ongoing work managing Bradley's public image. From her perspective, personal narratives could easily be turned into strategic advantages. "Sometimes those sacrifices are part of building a company," she said smoothly. Elliot raised an eyebrow. "You sacrificed the marriage for the business." Bradley laughed lightly. "Well, you could say that." The comment drifted easily through the room. No one challenged it. But Vanessa, who understood the mechanics of reputation better than most people in the room, made a mental note. Statements like that, once repeated publicly, became difficult to withdraw. Across the bay that same evening, Zara sat quietly in Margaret Holloway's office, reviewing the latest financial discovery documents submitted by Daniel Reeves. The stack of papers was thick. Bank statements, tax filings, company valuation reports. Daniel's team had clearly prepared carefully. Margaret flipped through several pages before setting the stack down. "They're confident," she said. Zara nodded. "That seems consistent." Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair. "Daniel Reeves has built his entire strategy on the assumption that the company is Bradley's primary asset. That's reasonable." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You're remarkably generous toward your opponent." Zara looked at the documents again. "They're working with the information they have." Margaret smiled faintly. "Which is incomplete." She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out another folder. This one was thinner, but the documents inside carried far more weight. Trust agreements, investment confirmations, board minutes. Margaret placed the folder on the table between them. "This is what changes everything." Zara didn't open it. She already knew every page inside. Margaret tapped the cover lightly. "Once these documents enter the courtroom, Record Bradley's narrative collapses." Zara remained calm. Margaret continued. "But there's another detail that will matter just as much." Zara looked up. His statement. What statement? Margaret slid a printed transcript across the table. It was from the podcast Bradley had recorded several weeks earlier. Zara read the highlighted line quietly. "Some people aren't built for the life of building a company." Margaret folded her hands. "That line suggests you had no role in creating the business." Zara nodded. "Yes." Margaret leaned forward slightly. "Which means if Bradley repeats that claim under oath." Zara finished the sentence calmly. "He'll be contradicting the company's financial history." Margaret smiled. Exactly. The difference between public narrative and documented fact often became the turning point in legal cases. And Bradley had spent months strengthening a narrative that would soon collide with signed agreements and bank records. Meanwhile, across the bay, Bradley's confidence reached its highest point yet. A week before the next hearing, Daniel Reeves invited him to review final preparation strategies in his downtown office. Daniel closed the door behind them and placed a stack of documents on the conference table. "We'll keep this simple," he said. Bradley sat down. "I like simple." Daniel nodded. "The judge already understands that you built the company." Bradley relaxed. Daniel continued. When asked about your wife's role, answer honestly. Bradley shrugged. That's easy. Daniel glanced at his notes. Did Zara contribute to the business in any meaningful financial way? Bradley shook his head. No. Did she manage operations, Nummo? Daniel leaned back slightly. Then your testimony will be straightforward. Bradley smiled. Exactly what I expected. Daniel studied him for a moment. You're very confident? Bradley nodded. Because I know the truth. Across the city, Zara sat quietly at her apartment desk, reviewing the same trust agreement Margaret had shown her earlier. 3 years earlier, the document had been just another legal safeguard protecting Arthur Whitmore's investment. Now it had become something else entirely. A silent correction waiting to enter the record. She closed the folder gently. Outside, the city lights reflected across the dark water of the bay. Inside the quiet apartment, the same calm that had guided Zara through years of building financial systems settled around her again. The next hearing would not be dramatic. There would be no shouting, no emotional confrontation, just questions and answers given under oath. But one answer in particular would matter more than the others. Because somewhere inside that courtroom, Bradley Pennington would say the sentence he had repeated many times before. The sentence he believed completely, that his wife had built nothing. And when he did, the record Zara had preserved for years would begin quietly proving otherwise. The morning of the next hearing arrived colder than usual. San Francisco's fog had rolled in from the bay overnight, covering the city in a pale gray haze that made the courthouse look even more austere than it already did. Inside the building, the routine had not changed. Security checks, quiet hallways, lawyers carrying folders that contained the fragile architecture of other people's lives. Bradley Pennington arrived early again. Daniel Reeves walked beside him, reviewing a few final notes as they moved down the hallway toward the courtroom. Remember, Daniel said quietly, keep your answers direct. Bradley nodded. I will. Daniel paused briefly. And avoid speculation. Only answer what's asked. Bradley gave a confident smile. I've got this. From Daniel's perspective, the case still appeared straightforward. The documents submitted during discovery had revealed nothing particularly threatening. Zara held no direct employment contract with Pennington Freight Solutions. No salary. No executive title. Daniel expected the hearing to focus mostly on financial disclosures and clarifying property divisions. Nothing about the case suggested a major surprise. Across the hallway, the elevator doors opened. Zara stepped out alongside Margaret Holloway. She wore the same calm expression she had carried through every stage of the process. In her hand was a single folder, the same one Margaret had prepared days earlier. Margaret noticed Bradley immediately. Ready, she asked quietly. Zara nodded. Yes. Margaret adjusted the documents inside the folder. Good. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere remained calm and procedural. Judge Eleanor Matthews entered promptly at 9 o'clock. The clerk called the case again. Pennington versus Pennington. Both attorneys approached their respective tables. Daniel Reeves rose first as expected. Your Honor, we're prepared to proceed. Margaret nodded. So are we? Judge Matthews looked over the file in front of her. This hearing will address ownership interests and financial disclosures related to the marital estate. Daniel stepped forward. Your Honor, the petitioner will clarify his role in the creation and management of Pennington Freight Solutions. The judge gestured for him to continue. Daniel turned slightly toward Bradley. Mr. Pennington, please explain to the court your involvement in founding the company. Bradley stood confidently. I founded Pennington Freight Solutions approximately 5 years ago. And your role in building the company, I developed the business model, secured clients, and managed its growth. Daniel nodded. Did your wife play a role in founding the company? Bradley answered without hesitation. Not really. Across the courtroom, Zara sat quietly beside Margaret. Daniel continued. Did she contribute financially to the company's development? Bradley shook his head. No. Did she manage any operational departments? Numter Daniel turned slightly toward the judge. Your Honor, as you can see, the company was built and managed entirely by Mr. Pennington. Judge Matthews wrote a brief note. Then she looked toward Margaret Holloway. Miss Holloway Margaret stood calmly. Your Honor, we would like to clarify several financial details. Daniel remained relaxed. Margaret approached the podium and opened the folder Zara had brought. Mr. Pennington, she said, turning toward Bradley, you mentioned that you secured the funding necessary to grow your company. Bradley nodded. Yes. Margaret held up a document. Do you recall receiving an investment of $2.5 million 3 years ago? Bradley blinked slightly. Yes. And where did that investment come from? Bradley hesitated for a fraction of a second. A private investor. Margaret nodded. Arthur Whitmore. Yes. Margaret placed the document on the podium. Your Honor, we would like to submit the Whitmore investment agreement into the court record. Daniel frowned slightly. Judge Matthews gestured for the clerk to receive the document. Margaret continued speaking calmly. Mr. Pennington, when Mr. Whitmore invested $2.5 million into your company, how was that investment structured? Bradley shifted slightly. I don't remember the exact details. Margaret lifted another document. This is the equity agreement signed during that investment. Daniel stepped forward. Your Honor, Judge Matthews raised a hand. Let her finish. Margaret continued. The agreement states that the investment equity was placed in a trust. Bradley looked confused. Yes, I think so. Margaret turned toward Zara briefly before continuing. And who manages that trust? Bradley didn't answer immediately. Margaret read directly from the document. The managing trustee is Zara Pennington. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter. Daniel leaned forward suddenly. Your Honor, we have not yet reviewed these documents. Margaret remained composed. They were submitted during discovery. Judge Matthews looked down at the pages now placed before her. Continue, Miss Holloway. Margaret nodded. The trust created during the Whitmore investment holds 37% equity in Pennington Freight Solutions. Bradley's head turned toward Daniel. Daniel looked stunned. Margaret finished calmly. And Zara Pennington is the managing trustee of that equity. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything spoken so far. Judge Matthews looked directly at Bradley. Mr. Pennington, is this agreement accurate? Bradley opened his mouth, then closed it again. I signed the investment documents. Daniel quickly leaned toward him, whispering something urgently. Margaret spoke again. Your Honor, we would also like to introduce the wire transfer records associated with this investment. Another document appeared. The clerk passed it to the judge. Judge Matthews read it carefully. $2.5 million. Whitmore Capital Holdings. Equity allocation tied to the trust. The judge leaned back slightly. So the respondent controls 37% of the company through this trust? Margaret nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Daniel stood immediately. Your Honor, we request time to review these documents. Judge Matthews looked at him calmly. These documents were submitted weeks ago. Daniel said nothing. Across the courtroom, Bradley stared at the papers in front of him as if seeing them for the first time. Because in many ways, he was. 3 years earlier, he had signed the agreement quickly. At the time, the company needed money desperately. Arthur Whitmore's investment had saved them. But Bradley had barely studied the legal structure behind it. He remembered the capital. He remembered the relief. He had never remembered the trust. And certainly not who controlled it. Judge Matthews closed the file slowly. This court will need to review the ownership structure carefully before making further decisions regarding marital assets. Margaret nodded respectfully. Of course, Your Honor. Across the room, Bradley remained silent. For the first time since the divorce proceedings began, the confidence that had guided him through every conversation and interview had vanished. because the story he had told for years, that he alone had built the company, was now colliding with something far stronger: signed documents, verified transfers, and a trust he had never truly understood. And standing quietly beside Margaret Holloway, Zara Pennington said nothing at all. She simply watched the records speak. The courtroom did not erupt. There were no gasps, no dramatic whispers spreading across the benches. Real legal proceedings rarely resembled the chaos of television dramas. Most reactions arrived quietly, almost invisibly. But the atmosphere in the room had shifted. A few minutes earlier, Bradley Pennington had stood confidently before the judge, describing a company he believed he controlled completely. Now, a set of documents resting on Judge Eleanor Matthews' bench suggested something far more complicated. Bradley sat slowly back in his chair. Daniel Reeves leaned toward him, immediately speaking in a low voice. "Why didn't you tell me about this trust?" Daniel whispered. Bradley rubbed his forehead. "I didn't think it mattered." Daniel stared at him. 37% equity matters. Bradley said nothing. Across the room, Zara remained seated beside Margaret Holloway, her hands folded calmly over the folder that had contained the documents. Margaret watched the judge review the pages carefully. The Whitmore investment agreement, the trust formation papers, the wire transfer confirmations. Everything was in order. Every signature visible. Every number verifiable. Judge Matthews finally looked up. "Mr. Reeves," she said. Daniel stood quickly. "Yes, Your Honor." "Did your client disclose this equity structure during financial discovery?" Daniel hesitated. "Your Honor, we were aware of the Whitmore investment, but the trust arrangement was not clearly understood." Judge Matthews raised an eyebrow. "The agreement appears very clear." Daniel glanced at Bradley briefly before answering. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge turned toward Margaret. "Miss Holloway, your position is that the respondent controls this trust." "Yes, Your Honor. And that trust holds 37% of the company." "That is correct." Judge Matthews tapped the edge of the document lightly with her pen. "That represents a significant ownership interest." Margaret nodded. "It does." The judge turned toward Bradley. "Mr. Pennington, do you dispute the authenticity of these documents?" Bradley looked at the papers again. He recognized the signatures. His signature. Zara's. Arthur Whitmore's. "No," he said quietly. Judge Matthews made another note. "Very well." The legal implications were now unavoidable. What had appeared to be a relatively simple divorce, involving a founder protecting his company, had suddenly become something entirely different. A dispute involving a major shareholder. And the court had not yet heard the full financial history. Margaret spoke again. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, we would like to introduce additional documentation regarding the operational development of Pennington Freight Solutions." Daniel immediately stood. "Your Honor, we request time to review these materials before they enter the record." Judge Matthews considered the request briefly. "That seems reasonable." Margaret nodded. "We have no objection to allowing opposing counsel time to review the documents." The judge looked down at the calendar on her desk. "This hearing will be continued next week to allow both parties to review the ownership structure." She paused before adding something else. "However, it is clear that the respondent's financial interest in the company must be considered when determining marital assets." Daniel nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." The hearing concluded shortly afterward. But as the courtroom slowly emptied, the difference in posture between the two sides had become unmistakable. Bradley gathered his papers slowly. His earlier confidence had disappeared. Daniel spoke quietly but firmly. "We need to review every document related to that trust." Bradley exhaled. "I didn't think it would matter this much." Daniel looked directly at him. "In divorce court, equity always matters." Across the room, Margaret closed her folder and turned toward Zara. "That went exactly as expected," she said. Zara nodded. "Yes." Margaret studied her client for a moment. "You're remarkably calm for someone who just revealed control of 37% of a company." Zara answered honestly. "I've known about it for 3 years." Margaret smiled faintly. "Fair point." They walked together toward the courthouse exit. Outside, the fog had begun to lift slightly, revealing a thin layer of sunlight over the city streets. Meanwhile, Daniel Reeves pulled Bradley aside in the hallway. "Let's be clear about something," Daniel said. Bradley looked exhausted. "But you may still hold the largest individual share of the company." Bradley nodded. "Yes, but with Zara controlling 37% through that trust, the court will treat her as a major stakeholder." Bradley frowned. "What does that mean?" Daniel spoke carefully. "It means the judge will likely consider her influence over the company when dividing marital assets." Bradley looked back toward the courtroom doors. "Can she take the company?" Daniel shook his head. "Not entirely." Bradley relaxed slightly. But Daniel continued, "She now has enough leverage to effect control." The meaning settled heavily between them. 3 years earlier, Bradley had signed the Whitmore investment agreement, quickly focused only on the immediate relief the capital provided. He had not studied the trust clause. He had not considered the possibility that the equity structure might matter someday. Now, it mattered more than anything else. Across the courthouse plaza, Zara and Margaret stood near the steps. Margaret checked the time. "We'll meet again tomorrow to review the next filings." Zara nodded. Margaret hesitated before asking something she had been wondering about. "You could try to take operational control if you wanted." Zara looked toward the traffic moving slowly along the street. "That isn't my goal." Margaret studied her. "You're not interested in revenge?" "No." "Then what do you want?" Zara answered quietly. "Accuracy." Margaret smiled. "That's a rare objective in divorce court." They said goodbye and walked in different directions. Meanwhile, Bradley sat alone inside Daniel Reeves' office later that evening, reviewing copies of the documents Margaret had introduced. The trust agreement lay open on the desk. He read the clause again. Managing trustee, Zara Pennington. 37% equity. The numbers had been there all along. He had simply never noticed. For the first time since filing for divorce, Bradley understood something important. The story he had told everyone, including himself, about building the company alone, had never been entirely true. And now inside a courtroom where stories mattered far less than contracts, that truth was beginning to surface line by line. Next week's hearing would decide what happened next. But one thing had already become clear. Zara Pennington was not leaving the marriage with nothing. By the time the final hearing approached, the atmosphere around the case had changed completely. 3 weeks earlier, Bradley Pennington had walked into court believing the divorce would be a simple legal formality, an administrative step separating two lives that had already moved apart. Now the situation looked very different. Daniel Reeves had spent those weeks examining every document connected to the Whitmore investment. There were no loopholes, no technical errors, no ambiguous language that could be interpreted in Bradley's favor. The trust agreement was precise. Arthur Whitmore's $2.5 million investment had secured 37% equity in Pennington Freight Solutions, and that equity was managed entirely by Zara Pennington. The company Bradley believed he controlled alone had always been more complicated. The final hearing took place on another quiet morning in the same San Francisco courtroom. But the energy in the room felt different now. Bradley arrived without the casual confidence he had carried before. Daniel walked beside him, speaking carefully. "We're not here to fight this," Daniel said. Bradley nodded slowly. "I understand." Across the hallway, Zara arrived with Margaret Holloway. Margaret carried only a thin folder this time. Most of the necessary documents were already in the court record. "Today should be straightforward," Margaret said quietly. Zara nodded. "Yes." Inside the courtroom, Judge Eleanor Matthews reviewed the case file for several minutes before speaking. "This court has examined the equity structure of Pennington Freight Solutions," she said calmly. Both parties stood. The judge continued. "The Whitmore investment agreement confirms that the Pennington Strategic Trust holds 37% ownership in the company." She glanced toward Zara briefly. And that trust is managed by the respondent, Zara Pennington. Bradley listened silently. Judge Matthews continued. Given this structure, the company cannot be considered the sole property of the petitioner. Daniel Reeves nodded respectfully. We understand, Your Honor. Margaret remained still beside Zara. The judge reviewed several additional documents before continuing. The court recognizes that Mr. Pennington remains the company's primary operator and CEO. Bradley looked up slightly. However, the judge's next words carried equal weight. But the respondent's equity stake represents a significant marital asset. The legal balance had been established. The court now had to decide how that asset would be treated. Judge Matthews turned toward Zara. Mrs. Pennington, the court recognizes that you have the legal right to retain your trust ownership. Zara nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The judge continued. You may also pursue control measures through the company's board if you choose. Daniel glanced toward Bradley. Bradley remained silent. Then the judge asked the question that would shape the outcome. Do you intend to retain this ownership interest? The courtroom waited. For weeks, Bradley had imagined this moment in the worst possible ways. He had imagined Zara using the trust to take operational control, replacing him, dismantling the company, punishing him for everything that had happened between them. But Zara's answer arrived calmly. No, Your Honor. Even Margaret glanced toward her briefly. Judge Matthews raised an eyebrow. No, Zara continued. I intend to sell my trust shares. The room remained quiet. The judge studied her. To whom? A private investment fund that has already expressed interest. Margaret stepped forward slightly. The transaction will allow the company to continue operating without disruption. Judge Matthews considered this for a moment. That would provide both parties with financial settlement while maintaining corporate stability. Yes, Your Honor. Daniel Reeves leaned toward Bradley again. This may actually help you, he whispered. Bradley understood. A structured sale would prevent a prolonged legal battle over company control. Judge Matthews closed the file. Very well. She reviewed the proposed settlement documents briefly before continuing. The court accepts the agreement submitted by both parties. The divorce would proceed. The equity would be sold. The proceeds would be divided according to the settlement structure Margaret and Daniel had negotiated during the previous week. Bradley remained CEO, but the company's ownership would shift. The Whitmore Trust shares would pass to the investment fund. Within months, that fund would acquire additional shares from other minor investors. And eventually Bradley would find himself answering to a board that no longer revolved around him. But none of that happened inside the courtroom. Inside the courtroom, the legal process ended quietly. Judge Matthews spoke the final words of the hearing. The court grants the dissolution of marriage between Bradley Pennington and Zara Pennington. The gavel struck once. The case was finished. Bradley remained seated for a moment after the judge left. The room slowly emptied around him. Across the aisle, Zara gathered her folder and stood. Margaret leaned toward her. You could have kept the shares, Margaret said quietly. Zara nodded. I know. Why didn't you, Zara, look toward the courtroom door? Because the company doesn't need another war. Margaret studied her. You're walking away from a great deal of power. Zara answered simply, I never needed it. They walked together toward the exit. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun had finally pushed through the fog that had covered the city earlier in the day. Bradley stepped out several minutes later. For a moment, he saw Zara standing near the steps. She was speaking quietly with Margaret. He walked toward her. Zara turned when she heard his footsteps. Neither of them looked angry, just tired. I didn't expect that, Bradley said. The sale, yes. Zara nodded slightly. It makes things simpler. Bradley studied her. You could have destroyed me in there. Zara looked at him calmly. That was never the point. Bradley hesitated. Then what was Zara thought for a moment before answering? The truth. Bradley said nothing. For the first time in years, he understood how much of the company's story he had misunderstood. Zara turned slightly toward the street. "I hope the company does well," she said. Bradley nodded. "It probably will." Zara gave a small, polite smile. Then she walked down the courthouse steps and disappeared into the afternoon traffic of San Francisco. She didn't look back. In the end, the most dramatic moments in life rarely happen the way people expect. There was no revenge speech, no public humiliation, no celebration of victory. Zara Pennington had spent years building systems that relied on something far more reliable than anger. Records, numbers, agreements that quietly preserved the truth long after people stopped remembering it correctly. When Bradley Pennington stood in court and said his wife had built nothing, he believed it. Not because he intended to lie, but because success had slowly rewritten his memory. The documents Zara kept never changed. Bank transfers, equity agreements, board records. They waited patiently until the moment when someone finally asked the right questions. And when that moment arrived, the truth didn't need to shout. It simply appeared. Zara didn't leave the courtroom with applause or revenge. She left with something quieter: dignity. The kind that comes from knowing the facts, never needed, defending only revealing. And sometimes the strongest response to being underestimated is not to argue at all. It is to let the record speak when the time finally comes. If this story made you reflect on how truth often moves more slowly than confidence, feel free to share your thoughts below. And if you're watching from somewhere in the world today, let us know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoy thoughtful stories about justice, patience, and quiet strength, you're welcome to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because sometimes the loudest victories are the ones that never needed to be loud at all.